Um, anyway, we're recording, and if you remember last time, we left off going over the Great Awakening. Today, what I'd like to do, and we'll see if I can actually do this or not, is talk about the English administration of the colonies, on how they tried to control colonial trade through the Navigation Acts and then the Dominion of New England, and then we'll get to what we call the Glorious Revolution. And then what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about wars, and then we'll get to the French and Indian War, sometimes known as the 7 Years' War, and we'll finish that off tonight, and its impact on America, and really sort of sets the stage for the American Revolution. So if we go back to the English administration of the colonies, now, this is that period of mercantilism, right? We all remember mercantilism, that the wealth of the world was fixed in gold and silver. The only thing that ever changed was your percentage of that gold and silver. And the goal, or the game really, was to get more of that gold and silver than your other countries. And you did this by exporting more than you imported. And so you would have raw materials come from your colonies, and your colonies would also be a source of manufactured goods. Of course, now manufactured goods are more valuable. This leaves the American colonies often in a state of debt. They don't have a lot of hard currency. But if you remember a while back, I said there were a couple things that Americans were, and maybe still are. They're going to be tax cheats. They're going to be smugglers. Not so surprising. And then later on, we're going to see they're conspiracy theorists. There's a lot of that in American history. Well, they're smugglers. And so for the British, they don't like this. They don't like the colonies trading with other countries. And in the end, and we'll call them Americans as opposed to colonists. They wanted to trade with France. They would trade with Portugal. They would trade with everybody, because they were interested in making a buck. They weren't supposed to do that. It was a violation of British law. And so the British will pass a series of navigation acts. Now, we could go through every navigation act, and there's going to be several of them. And they all have different aspects to them, but their main goal was to try to control American trade, to stop the Americans from trading with these other countries. And they're not going to be effective. And the reason was that enforcement was a problem, right? You can pass laws, but enforcing them is always going to be much more difficult. So you're passing a law in England, and then you're trying to enforce it 3,000 miles away. That is hard to do, obviously. It would be like if you had a son or a daughter, and they were going to go off to college in, I don't know, Maine, and you told them, well, hey, you're going to be in your room at 9 o'clock every night, or you're in trouble. Well, enforcing that while you're sitting in Texas is very difficult. And this is a good point to make. This is really the relationship between the mother country and the colonist. The mother country sees the colonists as their children. In fact, the colonies agree to this. The colonies see the mother country as the parent. And that's why this rebellious stock is hard for the colonials later on. But they do see that kind of relationship. So the Navigation Acts don't work very well. Well, in 1685, Charles II had died. You take it over from Charles I, who had his head chopped off, right, by Oliver Cromwell. And then James II takes over. Now, he's going to be their first Catholic sovereign. Yeah, I know, you Lutherans out there. Their first Catholic sovereign since Queen Mary. And he goes, okay, I'm going to get control of the colonies. So he creates what they call the Dominion of New England. So it takes all the New England colonies all the way down to New Jersey and makes them into sort of a super colony. Now, James II would have done this for the southern colonies eventually, but he doesn't have time. So here under the government, this Dominion of New England, the government would be named by royal authority. No more colonial assemblies, no more governors. There'd be one governor appointed by the king and a council appointed by the king and no colonial assembly. All right, so in other words, so here we are in 1685. since 1619, the colonies have been used to governing themselves, right? We've talked about this. And now here they are trying to stop them from governing themselves. So the first governor appointed, and the last one of the Dominion Ring, there's a guy named Sir Edmund Andros. Now Andros, he's a soldier. That's his primary job. He's good at taking and giving orders, like a good soldier is. He's honest. He's efficient. He's incredibly loyal. His only problem is that he's totally tactless. He has no sense of diplomacy about him, and he will cause resentment in the colonies. So some of the things he does is he doesn't allow town meetings to occur, right? Now, why would you try to stop town meetings? Because you're afraid that they may be saying something about you, and you fear what the people might do. See if that sounds familiar. He challenged land titles. Now, this is probably what gets him in the most trouble, is that a lot of these founders had land titles. Thank you for letting me let Lori Glover in. A lot of these colonials had land titles, and they didn't want to give them up because they all speculated in land. They wanted to have these vast acreages that they could sell off. And he decides that, hey, I'm not going to recognize those titles anymore. And then those people who protest, he arrests and he fines them. He throws them in jail. He took over a Puritan church for Anglican worship. And then he started levying taxes without consent. Now, this is one of those things that obviously Edmund Andros had the power to do, but wasn't in his best interest. Would Andros been better off saying, look, I need a place to worship, I'm Anglican, is there a church I can use, rather than just kicking the Puritans out? Probably. Could he have gone to these colonists and say, look, we need to levy taxes because we need to provide for common defense and these things need to be taken care of? Absolutely, but he doesn't do those things. He says, I have absolute power, therefore I'm going to do whatever I want. He's highly resented in the colonies. Well, the English, on the other hand, are also tired of James II. They don't like Catholic rule. And this is something that we're going to see throughout American history. There's really a lot of anti-Catholic feelings. Even today, right, we have a new Supreme Court justice nominee, and they're talking about her being Catholic. Well, majority of the Supreme Court's Catholic. What we're living into is really a more modern acceptance of Catholics as opposed to John F. Kennedy. But just to tell you, this sort of anti-Catholic feeling has been around in American history for a long time. So they're tired of James II as a Catholic, and so they said, okay, look, what can we do? And they go, why don't we invite James's Protestant daughter, Mary, and her husband, the Dutch leader, William of Orange, to come over and jointly rule? So they asked James's daughter, hey, would you and your hubby come over and sort of kick out your dad? And of course they said, absolutely yes. So James II has to flee to France. Now, when the news hits back in the colonies that James II has been gone, the colonists immediately arrest Andros and his men. Now, all the colonies will revert back to their normal status, except for Massachusetts, which becomes a royal colony, but separate story. But the idea of this glorious revolution is a setup for the American Revolution, because they don't just allow William and Mary to come over freely. They don't just say, yeah, you're now the kings. They say, you're now going to be a constitutional monarchy. In other words, you have some power, but most of the power is going to be in the hands of the Parliament. So no longer this divine right idea is that, hey, the Parliament is saying we're putting you in here and you can stay as long as we feel comfortable with you. Now, this leads to John Locke, who we had mentioned earlier in the last lecture, to write his 2 treatises on government, which he said, 1, there is no divine right of kings. And 2, he says, it's government by consent, and that people have natural rights. And again, these 2 things are going to play a major part in the American Revolution and, of course, the Declaration of Independence. So let's talk about some of the wars that's going to affect the colonies. Now, as you know, no offense to Europeans out there, But the Europeans just love to get into war in this time period. I mean, it's almost constant war. There's King William's War, King George's War, Queen Anne's War. I mean, it's one war after another. So none of those really affect the American colonies, not too much. They don't have that big impact. But this last war that we want to mention that does have a huge impact, and I've got a map on it because somebody has suggested I use a map, therefore I am, is going to be the French and Indian War, or sometimes known as the 7 Years' War, 1754 to 1763. Now, for you math people out there, you're going, wait a minute, 1754 to 63, that's 9 years. Well, it just depends on your point of view, right? The Americans call it the French and Indian War. For the British, it's the 7 Years' War because it really starts a little bit later than we count it. And it has other names too throughout Europe. So we're just going to call it the French and Indian War. That's an easy way to say it. So let's talk about what's going on here. And just keep an eye on the map. And if you look here in this Ohio country right here that I'm circling, this was somewhat disputed between Britain and France, who should occupy this area. And of course, the Virginians really wanted to occupy all of this area. They saw this as new land. Well, in 1749, French scouts had proceeded down the Allegheny River and Ohio rivers to spy out the land and to find Indian allies. And they buried leaden plates with inscriptions stating that this was French lands. Now, of course, dropping an inscripted piece of lead on the ground doesn't necessarily make your soil French. But in 1753, a new French governor, the Marquis Duquesne, arrived in Canada and set good on making his claim by putting a series of forts in the region, saying this is our land and this is how we're going to prove it. We're going to build forts. Well, when the news of these forts started reaching Williamsburg, Virginia, the governor sent out an emissary to warn off the French. Now he says, look, I need somebody who's got some guts. I need somebody with some ambition. I need somebody to get there and tell the French what for. And so there was this young adjutant general of the Virginia militia, this guy named George Washington, whose older brothers owned part of the Ohio Company, which is the land we're talking about. He goes, I'll go. So Washington makes his way out to Fort LeBeau and returns with a polite but firm refusal, right? The French say, go away, you silly English types, or they'll taunt you a second time, for you Monty Python fans. So the governor says, okay, here's what we're going to do. If they're going to build a fort, the Virginia governor says, then we'll build a fort. Okay, that makes sense. It's going to sound childlike, I know. So he sends out a group to build a fort where the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers meet to form the Ohio River, the three rivers. If you go there today, there's a little spot right at the corner of the three rivers. And here they're going to build a fort. Well, no sooner than they started building this fort, here comes the French with a larger force, and they kick them out. And so we're going to build our own fort here, Fort Duquesne. Now, on the same spot. Fort Duquesne will eventually become Pittsburgh. That's where Pittsburgh is located today. Meanwhile, George Washington had been organizing a force of volunteers in the spring of 1754 to go out and try to warn off the French again. He goes out with an advance guard and a few Indian allies. And near Great Meadows, they skirmished with a French detachment. It's the first bloodshed of a long and finally divisive war that reached beyond America. Now, Washington had a mistake. He had Indian allies who supposedly killed French prisoners, including a French officer. Well, Washington had prisoners. He knew the French were now coming after him in larger numbers. And this is where Washington learns one of his most valuable skills that's going to take him through the American Revolution. And that's how to run away. Washington is well known for running away. Now, that sounds terrible. I don't mean it to be terrible, but when we get to the American Revolution, you'll see why it's important that he knows to run away. So he runs away, but he knows that the French are going to catch up with him. So he real quickly, he builds a fort just out of necessity, which he names Fort Necessity. But it's not really much of a fort. It's some logs and some mud thrown together. It's soon under siege by the French, and Washington has to surrender. Now, in signing the surrender document, Washington doesn't read French, and he just signs it. Well, it says that he had assassinated people, that he had acted dishonorably. Never sign something that you can't read. But he's allowed to go back. Well, back in London, they decided, all right, it's time for a showdown. It's time that we are going to have to get rid of the French. America is not big enough for English and French. Strangely enough, and I'm not going to get too detailed on this, Ben Franklin had come up with an idea at this time, what he called the Albany Plan of Union, which might have avoided the American Revolution. We made it end up in like Canada if we'd done it. It called for a chief executive of the colonies, a supreme governor, to be called the President General of the United Colonies. There'd be a Supreme Assembly called the Grand Council, and they would oversee matters of defense, Indian relations, trade, and settlement in the West, and they would levy taxes in support of these programs, but still be loyal to England. It doesn't go anywhere. So London decides time to get rid of the French. In 1755, a British fleet captured Nova Scotia, as you can see on the map, and expelled most of the French population. If you would not take an oath of allegiance to the British Empire, you had to leave. Okay, here we go. Many of these Frenchmen in Acadia, and you can see that's just Nova Scotia, eventually will make their way slowly down to French Louisiana, where they become, okay, who can make the guess? Anybody? The Acadians become what we know today as the Cajuns. It's a derivative of the word Acadian. So Cajuns are Acadians, and they came originally from this French and Indian War. Well, the British sent a new general to America. His name is General Edward Braddock, and he arrives in Virginia with two regiments of regulars. And he's got George Washington willing to volunteer on his staff. And Braddock likes Washington. He's eager and stuff. And Washington wants nothing more than to be a member of the British Army. He wants to be an officer in the British Army. But Braddock doesn't think much of colonial troops. And he's not used to fighting in this style. And so what he does is he just goes with a long line of men out into the wilderness, straightforward. Now, Washington had tried to tell him, he said, look, you can't do that in America because they don't fight like they do in Europe. They don't fight in these blocks and move from place to place. We are going to get ambushed, is what will happen. Well, as you can imagine, General Braddock with Washington by his side and some guy at the end of the line by the name of Daniel Boone, strangely enough, they get attacked by the French and the Indians, ambushed, and they are surrounded. The British forces are panicking. Braddock is mortally wounded, and the man that rises to save the day is George Washington. Again, he organizes a retreat and gets them out of there. Braddock dies on the way back. Washington, this is strange, has bullet holes in his coat, right? Now, just think about that. What if one of those bullet holes had killed Washington? Washington writes an account about how exciting it was to hear the bullets whistle by. Apparently, King George read that account and thought that, you know what? Washington's a bit of an arrogant jerk. He wouldn't think so much if he'd actually been hit by one of those bullets. Well, to sum up this French and Indian War, we're not going to go through the whole thing. It ends up being a world war as they're fighting all over the world. They're fighting in India. They're fighting in South America. They're fighting in Canada. It's everywhere. And eventually, the British win. Somewhat easy to do. They win. And they end the war with the Peace of Paris of 1763. Now, this will end French power in North America. Britain takes all of French North American possessions east of the Mississippi, except New Orleans. They get all of Spanish Florida. In compensation for the loss of Florida, Spain received Louisiana. The loss of Louisiana left the French with no territory on the continent of North America. Well, what this means is this heritage of war is important because one of the things that it's going to do is it's going to make the French thirsty for revenge. Revenge! That's what they want. They're always looking for a way to get back at the British because this was a humiliating defeat. And whenever there's an American in France, you know, the French are going, so how are things with you and the British? Everything okay? Anybody mad at somebody else? Just wanting to know. So when you look at this, this is our map here. The French are thoroughly humiliated. Now, this is all the British gains they get after the war. It also has another impact that we should mention. It shows that there's a difference between the Americans and the British. Americans were starting to think of themselves a little bit more unique and not as so much English or British. They felt a sense of importance because they had fought this vast world war. And they also had a sense of resentment toward the British because the British didn't think much of militias. They didn't like the air of the British soldiers. They didn't like the way the British treated other soldiers by whipping them. And so they began to think that, you know what, we're morally superior than the British. I mean, we like the British because they're good at organizing their armies and stuff, but my gosh, the British troops were cursing, Sabbath breaking people, drinking a lot, brutally punishing people, offenses that could earn you, hundreds of lashes, and 1,000 lashes was the standard punishment for desertion. Now, on the other hand, the British didn't think much of the Americans. They thought Americans were just terrible soldiers, right? They would shoot and then run away. And that was all they would do. And you couldn't rely on colonial troops, that they wanted to go hide and shoot. And the British thought that was just ungentlemanly, to be honest. They said, that's not the way you fight a war. So the war ends. And if you look on here, this is going to be this, what we're going to call, well, right here, this Proclamation Line of 1763. Now, Britain had gained all this territory after the war, right here. For the Americans, they thought, great, now we have a chance to settle all of this area. Well, the British are saying, no, we're not going to settle all that area, people, because we just went into a major debt fighting this war, because a war that became a world war because it started in America. And so what the British do is they make this Proclamation Line of 1763 right here. They said, no American settlement past there. You're not allowed to go over in this area because that'll anger the Native Americans. And then we're stuck in another war having to pay for it. So you can't go. Well, the Americans didn't like this. They thought, man, we just fought a war to be able to get out into that area and get those lands. And now they're not letting us in. And now the British are stationing troops here. And so there was a lot of Americans who said, you know what? I think that Proclamation Line is sit there to control us. They want to pack us into an area. They've got these troops in here and they don't want us expanding. And that's going to lead to a lot of resentment. Now, of course, Americans don't like following a law very well. they'll soon start moving their way across that line. By 1770, the town of Pittsburgh had 20 log houses. So they are sneaking across that line. Well, as I said earlier, one of the issues that the British had was they had gone heavily into debt to fight this war. And so they said, okay, look, we got to pay for this somehow. And so what they decided to do was say, look, what we're going to do is that we are going to pass a tax. Now, they had some taxes in England that were unpopular, but they figured that they could tax the American colonies a little bit in order to pay for their common defense. Not the whole amount, a very small portion, really, to help pay for this common defense, to pay for the Navy that's guarding them, to pay for the troops that are protecting them. They felt like the Americans would be open to this. They'd say, look, you're getting taxed, and we're going to have you pay for your own defense. And so he comes up with the Stamp Act. There's the stamp right there. Now, what the Stamp Act did was, it says, look, it's going to put a tax on all printed matter. That means you have to have that stamp on any printed matter. And that meant legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, broadsides, almanacs, bonds, leases, deeds, licenses, insurance policies, ship clearances, college diplomas, dice and playing cards. Well, as you can imagine, if you were to go on the street of London that day that passed, and you were to go up and say, hey, what do you think of the Stamp Act? Most people would have said, the what? And no one would have thought anything about it. But in America, it's going to make everybody angry, right? You're talking about a tax on newspapers. So the people who print newspapers are mad. You're talking about tax on legal documents. So the most argumentative and probably educated group, the lawyers are going to be mad. And then the sailors and the lower classes who are just like to play dice and cards are paying tax. So you're making everybody mad here. And so in America, this is greeted with a lot of anger. In fact, we all know this slogan now. They began saying no taxation without representation. In other words, you can't tax us unless we have some representation in Parliament. Now, one of the ideas that the British come up with, and people pretty laugh at, was what they called virtual representation. They said, look guys, it's true you have no vote in Parliament, but neither did most Englishmen who lived in parts of England. Large cities like Manchester had nobody representing them. Well, for the Americans, it says, well, just because Manchester doesn't, they should. Now, here's the question. All right, so you're saying no taxation without representation, which is on the license plate of every Washington, D.C. car, by the way, today. How would you get representation, right? Because you're talking about a parliament 3,000 miles away and a time frame of 6 weeks there, 6 weeks back to travel. How could anybody legitimately represent the colonies in Britain without knowing exactly what the colonies are feeling at a particular time? You would have to be gone for a long time. So really determining how you would actually get representation is pretty difficult. Well, what do you do about the Stamp Act? You don't like it. So what you do is you protest it. You get a group of people that'll start organizing throughout the colonies. They'll call themselves the Sons of Liberty. In Boston, they put up what they call a liberty tree. They hang the stamp collector, the guy who issues the stamps, Andrew Oliver, in effigy here. They're sending a message. They're telling Mr. Oliver, if you try to collect taxes, this is where you're going to end up. And anybody who favored it could be subject to tar and feathering, which in most cases was going to be fatal, right? They would strip you naked, pour hot tar all over your body, and then put feathers all over you. To get the tar off, sometimes you'd be ripping off just thick slabs of your skin, which led to infection and you died. And then, of course, they would beat people up. They would tear down houses. So if you're really the British, right, you don't look at the Sons of Liberty as being some sort of patriotic group. They're really a terrorist organization, because their goal here is to terrorize anybody who's in favor of the Stamp Act and make it where they won't collect the stamp or collect the tax. So the Sons of Liberty are really going to be one of the first, sort of a terror group, depending on your point of view, obviously. Well, how do you fight it still, though? Well, a group gets together called the Stamp Act Congress. Now, you get 9 of the 13 colonies show up. I'm trying to get over to the Stamp Act Congress to pass resolutions to get the Parliament, to repeal the Stamp Act. Eventually, that's exactly what happens. They kick Grenville, the man who actually authorized the Stamp Act, out of his parliamentary position. He's no longer the prime minister, and they repeal the Stamp Act. Success. Everybody's happy about this. But on the same day that they repeal the Stamp Act in the Parliament, they also passed the Declaratory Act. Now, this is somewhat of a face-saving act. They're saying, look, okay, we repealed the Stamp Act, but we still have the power to make all laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So in other words, oh yeah, we took this back, but if we wanted to, we could still keep it. So that didn't work too well. So now they're going to try another series of taxes known as the Townsend Acts. Now, this put taxes on finished goods, glass, lead, paper, tea. And so again, what are the Americans going to do? They're still saying no taxation without representation. What they argue then is what we need to do is boycott. Boycott all British goods. And this is really the idea of John Dickinson in a series of letters known as Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer. Now, Dickinson's going to be one of the early heroes of the Revolution. He's one of a few people who actually attends the Declaration of Independence meeting, but does not sign it, but is also with the Articles of Confederation, and then is also at the Constitutional Convention later on. He's the guy that said, look, if your neighbor's house on fire, would you sit back and do nothing? Or would you help put it out? And so the idea is boycott British goods. And this means using what they call homespun, their own type of clothing. They won't wear fancy clothing. Instead of drinking British tea, they'll use sassafras tea. If you've ever had sassafras, for a long time it was one of the main ingredients of root beer until they found it was a carcinogen. It's no longer in root beer. But they would just avoid it, and they would make sure that they had to put pressure on everybody else, right? The boycott only works if you're pressuring everybody else to maintain it. And that's where the Sons of Liberties will come in again, led by Sam Adams. Now, this is a great picture of Sam Adams when he was governor of Massachusetts. But really, Sam Adams, you think of Sam Adams probably today because you think of beer, right? He did own a brewery, but he let it go bankrupt. Now, he's different than John Dickinson. Dickinson's one of these people that is looking for it to be, he's a moderate, he wants to find a way around these problems. Adams is not. Adams is a firebrand. Now, he's the cousin of John Adams. He never was really interested in money, right? So that's why his brewery goes out really fast. He liked being described as a plain, simple, decent citizen, middling of stature, dress, and manners. And he prided himself on frugality. He didn't like ceremony and displays of ceremony. Politics, not profits, was his passion. And he spent most of his time debating political issues with sailors at local taverns. He dressed in a dingy red coat, often with ink stains on his shirt. He'd bring his huge Newfoundland dog to the tavern while eating raw oysters and fish chowder, and he trained his dog to bite British redcoats. Now, you don't hear a lot about Sam Adams when they write the American Revolution, because when you write your nation's history and you're creating that origin myth, if you will, of your nation, you want really good people. And Sam Adams was a bit of a brigand, if you will, a bit of a cusser, you know, a person who liked to blow things up. Anthony, you'd have loved him. And so they don't like that as a role model for kids. So they said, look, we're going to push Sam Adams aside and we'll pick up other people instead that look better. George Washington, Ben Franklin. But no doubt about it, Sam Adams is one of these people that really wants to get the American Revolution started, along with another man by the name of James Otis. But we don't talk much about James Otis, although he really stirred a lot of people into revolution. He's hit by a redcoat in the head with a rifle, and then later sort of went into insane and died. Well, in 1768, 2 regiments of redcoats arrived in Boston. They were there because they didn't like all the trouble that was going on in Boston. They said, look, Boston is becoming a, what are we going to call it in the modern day, anarchy zone, something like that. And so they said, we are going to come in here and store these troops in Boston. Now, Ben Franklin, who had left the colonies and was living in London, and you know, Franklin had retired. Franklin wanted to be so accepted into London society. He really tried, but he didn't realize until later that he was never going to be accepted because he was a commoner, right? And Britain was not a meritocracy. But Franklin would testify, and he goes, look, don't send these troops here because you already have a group of people in Boston who feel like they're being repressed, and now you're sending troops. And he says, it's like taking a match into a room full of gunpowder. You're just asking for trouble, right? And that's exactly what happens. I think we all know this little incident. Let me move it on up here. Come on. There it is, the so-called Boston Massacre. Now, this is a highly inaccurate drawing by Paul Revere. It's an early, very good piece of propaganda. So in Boston on March 5th, 1770, there's the Custom House. And by the way, the Custom House is still there. You can go there, and in the center now, they have the spot where the shots were fired and the people fell. And so there was a couple of sentries on duty in front of the Customs House. Well, a group of rowdies came along and started taunting him and throwing some snowballs. So he called for reinforcements. Well, then somebody started ringing the church bell, and a larger crowd began to show up, and everybody was yelling and screaming. The British were armed. And then, as you can imagine, you got a lot of people with guns. It's a tense situation. A gun's going to go off. The colonists had been throwing snowballs, often with oyster shells in them. They hit one of the soldiers with a stick, and when he gets up, somebody's gun goes off, and the British open fire, right? With the first casualty probably being Crispus Attucks, a runaway slave. Now, this was probably, if you look at this picture here, by all accounts, this is a highly inaccurate picture, that these people weren't just nicely hanging around. That dog may have been there, I don't know. But the captain here was actually in front of his men and was trying to stop them from firing. But they go on trial. And they go on trial, and so they're looking for somebody to represent them. And the person that represents them is going to be John Adams. John Adams says, I'm going to prove to the British that British soldiers can get a fair trial. They're indicted for murder. And this doesn't make Adams a very popular person, but this is where Adams talks about facts being stubborn things. He described the crowd as a motley rabble of saucy boys, Negroes and mulattoes, Irish Teagues, and outlandish Jack Tars. And he actually proved that there was no order to fire, and the British captain was trying to protect the peace. He gets them all acquitted except for two. Two get convicted of manslaughter, and the crime for being convicted of manslaughter is being branded on your thumb. But John Adams, becomes much more respected in the colonies. He's well known for his honesty and fairness. Now, another event that happens just shortly after that is this one right here, the Gaspé Affair. A British schooner runs aground in Rhode Island, and a group of colonials board the ship, remove the crew, and burn the ship to the ground. Now, they were trying to find who it was so they could put him on trial, but they could not find anybody that would testify. And so they got away. Well, let me see how much further I've got here. Do I have my next part? Yes, I do. Let's bring us to the last thing here for the night, and that's going to be the Boston Tea Party. Now, the British government came up with a new idea. They said, okay, look, we've got these problems. People are mad. They don't like taxes. And so he came up with an idea. He says, look, we've got the East India Company, which is floundering because of spell bad business. They have this excess tea. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to pass what we call the Tea Act of 1773. And what it would do is it would put a minor tax on tea and ship it to America, and the tea would be more inexpensive than tea that you could buy in Britain. And for the British government, they said, look, there's no way that the colonists can complain about paying less for their tea. Really? I mean, there's a tax on it, yeah, but you're getting to pay less. Well, guess what? They can, right? The Americans go, no, this is, again, this is another tax without our permission. And so when the tea arrives in places like New York and Philadelphia, it went back to England because no one would take it, because the company agents were afraid of being beat up, their houses torn down. In Charleston, South Carolina, the tea is unloaded and put into a warehouse and is later sold to finance the revolution. But in Boston, this is going to be the tipping point. The governor of Boston, the royal governor, Governor Hutchinson, and Sam Adams decide they're going to engage in a test of will. Who's going to outlast the others? Now, the ship's captain carrying the tea said, maybe we ought to just go back. But Hutchinson, who's the governor, and stood to profit by the tea, by the way, demanded that the tea be landed and the tax paid. Now, what's going to happen here? Where the cargo's sitting there, it's 20 days. Well, on December 16th, a group of people disguised as Mohawk Indians, as we can see here, will leave from I think it's the Old South Meeting House, which still stands in Boston today, and you can go visit. Don't go to the place where they say the Tea Party ship is, because where the Tea Party happened has now been covered over, and there are buildings on wherever it was. But they dress up as Mohawk Indians, and they board the ships. Now, it's a very quiet affair. There's not a lot of yelling and screaming. It's very quiet. They go on there. They're very careful not to damage any private property. One lock is broken, and they send somebody to replace the lock, so there's no property damage, except for the tea. They take the tea, and they just drop it into the harbor. Ploop, 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 ploop. That's all it is. It's nothing so dramatic. Now, they did catch one person taking some of the tea and stuffing it in his pocket so he could bring the tea home. Really? Do you really want your tea that bad? They stripped him naked and made him run all the way back through the snow to his house in front of jeering crowds. But the Tea Party becomes really one of the greatest examples of what we call gesture politics. It's a gesture of defiance, And it's so important of a gesture that we still talk about it today. And it's a message that's strongly sent to the British government. Now, how will the British government respond to the Tea Party is something that we'll have to talk about next time. And when we talk about the coercive acts and these other acts they're going to lead us to the American Revolution. So that was a lot. That usually takes me 2 to 3 weeks to cover very quickly. But I have recorded this. I'm going to post it here in a little bit. But thanks everybody for showing up. I'm glad you were here. And Wednesday, I'll be doing another government lecture where we'll be talking about the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. But I'll put that out there. So spread the word. I'd like to get more people to pop in. Thank you, Lori, Anthony, for showing up and supporting. I always appreciate y'all for doing that. I appreciate what you do. So I'll post this on YouTube here in about an hour. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.